Hello, class. I want to provide a short video on necropolitics and necropower. I hope that you have had an opportunity to read the article. I know that it can be challenging and difficult, but I think that it's an important articulation of power in the contemporary moment that we must address. So, the first thing that we want to discuss with Mbembe's presentation of necropower is the idea of sovereignty, because sovereignty takes center stage in his articulation of power. Now, we can think of sovereignty as the premier manifestation of power. Now, what I mean by that is the sovereign has been described or understood as he or she who makes the decision. Now, the decision in this instance is the decision on whether one should live or one should die. If we think of a monarch, let's say we think of a king or queen, what constitutes their power is one of sovereignty. They can say at one moment, you must die, or you must live, off with your head, or to be burned, or whatever it is. But the sovereign has absolute power through the decision. Again, sovereignty, when we think about the power of the sovereign, we think about the decision over life or death, who should live or who should die, right? We can also say that this decision is also called right. So the sovereign has the right to decide over who should live or who should die. Now, traditionally, we know that the sovereign grounded or justified this power in religion. They argue that their power came from God as the ultimate justification or legitimization of their power over life or death. But again, just to reiterate, the sovereign is he or she who uses the decision as a premier hallmark of power. One decides who should live or who should die. And this decision is ultimate. The decision cannot be challenged. Now, Michel Foucault offers a theory of biopower, and we will be reading it this week and discussing it a bit more this week. But it's important just to touch upon it now because Mbembe wants to distinguish his idea of necropower from Foucault's biopower. Now, what is Foucault's biopower? Foucault argued that biopower was when sovereignty manifested itself as a domain of life over which power has taken control. So what the sovereign does through biopower is that it takes life itself as a premier feature of its power, its premier instrument of manifesting and exercising its power, so that the sovereign, or at least in a biopolitical order, the state is no longer exactly interested in the decision of who should live or who should die, but in biopower, the state is attempting to use life as a way of exercising power by making one live, right? Or letting one die. It is not so much off with your head as it was with the monarch, with that form of power, a sovereignty, but it is a new and more insidious form of sovereignty in which the state will use politics, instruments. We might think of things like the Health and Human Services Agency, in which the state now makes one live on, right? One does not, or we might even think of anti-abortion as a form of biopolitics, right? One must be born, right? One must be born, one must live. Now the state uses life as its instrument of power, right? By making one live on. So again, in short, what biopower is suggesting via Foucault is that life takes center stage in politics. And the objective of a biopolitical order and of biopower is to make one live on. And the making the not having a choice, but the making of a person live on, or the letting of one die, is the objective of biopower, right? We can also think of euthanasia and all of these discussions as forms of biopower, in which life becomes so important in the state's role and the exercise of its power. Now, Mbembe wants to depart from this, and he wants to challenge these presumptions in the 21st century. And he wants to argue that there's a new organization of politics, whereas in biopower, life became the most important objective and manifestation of the state's power. In necropolitics, death takes center stage. The state is not as much interested in making one live or die, but in using death as its premier articulation and manifestation of its power. So again, in a very simplistic way, we can say that necropower supplants life with death. That now death is the instrument in which the state is exercising its sovereign power, right? Its sovereign power through the decision. Now, one way that we can understand necropolitics is through war, right? Because we can say that what is interesting about war is that war is all about death. Right? War is not about making one live on or manipulating the conditions of one's life. War is really about making one die, right? War is about death. Death becomes the objective and the obsession of war. Now, what necropolitics wants to do is that it wants to blur the distinction between politics and war. Now, what we've done, at least according to Mbembe and modern democratic theory, is that modern democratic theory and democratic scholars, they argue that politics is all about what we call reason. And reason takes as its project autonomy and consensus. So when we are supposed to be reasoning subjects and rational, what that means is that we vote, we talk about things, we take consensus as free individuals, autonomy and consensus. So again, modern politics is supposed to be about resolving issues through reason, that we can use our reason to eliminate social ills, right? In a very simplistic way. What modern politics has also done is that it has also made war antithetical to politics, right? Whereas politics uses reason to resolve issues, right? Reason meaning that it respects life. It does not take life as an object, but it respects the life and the autonomy of the individual to make a decision and to engage in consensus. War is supposed to be just the opposite of that. War does not respect life. In fact, the loss of life is the objective of war. War is not about reaching a consensus. War is about domination and control and the destruction of the autonomous self. So again, just to clarify, in our modern political theory, we've made a distinction between politics on the one hand, which is about reason, autonomy, and freedom and consensus, and war on the other hand, which is about the destruction of life, which is about a devaluation of autonomy, and death becomes its objective. Now, biopower might rest on this binary, but for necropower, Mbembe wants to argue that in the 21st century, that these two things are no longer distinct, that they have blurred. In fact, politics resembles war now, so much so that the two cannot be distinguished. The two cannot be separated one from another. In fact, we can go as far to say that necropolitics is when war itself becomes politics, right? It is through war that the state exercises its power. It is through the obliteration, the annihilation of bodies, the devaluation of the human that the state is now exercising its power. Modern politics is war. So what Mbembe also wants to discuss is the way that what we might call our war politics wants to, as he says, quote, begin the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. So whereas we might say modern theory always thinks of the human not as a means, but always as an end. The human can never be a means of achieving something. Humanity must be valued as an end in of itself. Necropower does not do that. Necropower takes humanity, takes life. It takes life as a means, a mere instrument to achieve an objective. Right? So life becomes a tool of achieving something else. Life is no longer an end or a value in and of itself. Life is only a tool of war in which death is the ultimate objective, and death being a manifestation of the state's power. Right? So again, within a necropolitical order or necropower, necropower works by instrumentalizing life. Right? Life becomes just a tool. Life is no longer sacred and life is no longer valued. Death is what is most important. Now, he also talks about the way that death has been central in Western thought. And I will not discuss it in detail, but I will briefly just touch upon his discussion of Hegel and Bataille. What he wants to argue about Hegel is he wants to say that even for Hegel, death was very central. If we think that death has not been central to Western thought, then we are wrong. For Hegel, death is essential to the becoming subject. Now, what does he mean by this? He means that for Hegel, death has two manifestations. The one is that death is a form of negation, and we might think of negation as an overcoming. Man overcoming nature. Let's say that man exists in the world, and the way that man survives is that it overcomes nature. It negates nature. It turns nature into something else. Let's say man needs a house to protect it from the weather. Man will look at a tree and he will cut the tree down and build a house. He's taken something that nature gave him and he overcame it, right? And he built something else, right? So in one way, the cutting down of the tree is negating nature, turning nature into something else. But the building of the house is the second aspect of death, which is creation. That one creates something else, right? So death is central to the subject. The subject understands itself. The subject understands its existence through overcoming nature and through creating. And this is what we might call death. Bataille also has a theory of death in which life for him becomes mere utility or expenditure. And for him, expenditure becomes something like luxury. So if we think of, for example, a luxury car, right? If you want to drive a BMW, if you want a BMW, it's called a luxury car because one is spending more expenditure or more money on something that is not necessarily needed, right? A luxury is not a necessity. A luxury is mere pleasure, mere expenditure. For Bataille, life becomes mere luxury for us, and for that, the sovereign incorporates death within life. If life is seen as something like a luxury, it's not necessary, it's not needed, it can be expended, then the loss of that life elevates death. That death also becomes a sign of the sovereign's power, to the extent that the sovereign does not think of death as a limit. Right? We think of, for example, we're watching in our contemporary moment police brutality and what we're calling the ambush of police officers and of protests. And a consistent refrain is that one should avoid violence. Why should one avoid violence? Because one will never want to kill anyone else. Death is our limit, right? That as rational agents, as subjects, we respect life and limit death. You can do everything but get to death. When you kill a person, you've quote unquote crossed a line. Right? You've crossed a line because we recognize that line as being death. Death is not something that one should cross. But what Bataille and I believe Mbembe want to argue is that the sovereign does not recognize any line. Death is not a line. In fact, death is what is intimately connected to life, so that life becomes mere luxury, meaning that death is no longer a limit. So Mbembe also wants to talk about necropower as similar to colonial conquest in one way, although he will adapt that for the 21st century. But for our purposes, what happened during the colonial conquest? Let's say when a European country invaded and took over, let's say, a country in Africa or in the Americas. When a European actor, let's say, goes into Africa and takes over that country, there are no rules that govern what those who take over that country can do, right? So if you conquer, let's say, a country in Africa, what limits the power that you have in that country? In our history, what we've seen is that nothing limits their power. There is not a respect of life, and there's not a limit of death. In fact, the colonial space becomes a space in which the distinction between life and death is blurred. Life is just a mere instrument for the colonialist to achieve its ultimate aim of domination. The sovereign in such a space does not respect death as a limit. So what happened during the colonial era is that a horrific blurring between life and death occurred, in which life has become a mere instrument of the exercise of power, and death became also an objective of it. And what is also essential in the colonial era is the way that space has also been instrumentalized as an exercise of power within this drama. So when we think of occupation, we think of occupation as taking over a space and dividing a space. In fact, using space as an instrument of death and power has been the objective of necropolitics. So what he wants to also argue is that warfare is also different. We might say during the colonial era, one had to actually physically go into a space and one had to occupy that space, and the destruction of bodies took some time, right? You have to go in and you have to use your guns and you have to shoot many. In the 21st century, we can kill as many people as possible with just the press of a button, right? We can sit in our comfortable office and we can release a missile into a country and an entire population can die. So in necropolitics, part of the aim of necropolitics is how he describes it as the maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds. Again, in necropolitics, the objective is not to make one live on like biopolitics. The objective is to destroy as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible. Technology has enabled us to do that. During the colonial era, it was a bit more difficult to destroy entire populations, right? To commit acts of genocide because the technology did not allow for it. It took a long time. It was a brutal process. Now one can be disengaged from the act of destruction just by pressing a button. What's also different in necropolitics is that the way the body is used. The body now not only has space become an instrument of destruction, but the body itself has become an instrument of destruction, so that one uses one's own body as a weapon. And this is something that we might not have seen as much in previous forms of war. So the contemporary era of necropolitics uses space as a weapon of destruction. It uses bodies as a form of destruction. It does not recognize death as a limit. In fact, life and death are blurred to the point that the two become indissociable. And the objective of necropolitics is death. Right? The objective of it is to exercise sovereign power through death. It is not to exercise sovereign power through life anymore. So this, I think, and this is a very short skimming of the article and the argument, but I think these are the most important aspects of it. Again, to remember, just to reiterate, necropower is different from biopower. Biopower assumes that the state exercises this power through making a person live, right? Through rules, through regulations, through bureaucracies like the human health and servants agencies, through statistics, through biostatistics, through welfare policies, through all of these other bureaucratic regulations. Through bureaucracy, the state makes the person live on. And by making a person live, the state exercises its power. In the 21st century, one might argue this is no longer the case. The state is not as much interested in making populations live on to exercise its power as it is in the maximum destruction of bodies, the efficiency of destruction, and the blurring of the line between life and death. Death has become the objective of state sovereignty now. How can one maximize death as a way of exerting dominance and exerting power over life and death? So power in this instance is an instantiation and a manifestation of death, where life becomes mere luxury, mere utility, a mere instrument for achieving something else. I hope that this helps. And again, if you have questions, feel free to email me or contact me. Okay, great. Good luck with your papers.